more light than heat. And the great debate last year, I think the heat got too much and some chose to leave the great debate. And I'm hoping that with our panelists and debaters today, nothing of the same would actually, turn out to be the case. Let me, at this juncture, invite our first speaker, none other than Grace Muradzikwa, to come through. Grace, as some of you may know, is one of our leading insurance practitioners in Zimbabwe. And she led Diamond Insurance to a stellar performance and to become a leading organization within the country. So she's the true practitioner in that sense, well-versed in insurance matters, and now sitting at the pinnacle of the insurance and pensions industry at IPAC. So without much further ado, let's applaud her. I happen to share the same birthday as her, and so she will always be my twin somehow. So Grace, welcome.
Okay, good morning, and thank you very much, Nigel. I also want to thank you, my brother Kenyas, for this opportunity. I want to confess that I think when I received the initial invitation to participate in this debate, I was not quite sure because I think, as you quite rightly point out, this is a hot topic, and I wasn't quite sure, if we were ready for it, but. I think it's important, as you say, that we dialogue over this. I'm personally am very passionate about this topic, and I can tell you that's why I took this appointment. I saw a role, for all of us to play. And I am on record, I think, saying that apart from death, which we all know is coming, we just do not know when it's coming. The other very certain eventualities that we are all getting old. And, we will be pensioners. And that's why it's important for us to deal with this topic. So I want to thank you very much, I think, on behalf of the Insurance and Pensions Commission for allowing us to be part of this dialogue. So coming to the question, the big debate, the question is premised on the understanding that the Justice Smith-led Commission of Inquiry recommended compensation of pensioners to be done by government. This is not the case. I do not know how many people have actually read the very thick volume of the Justice Smith report. I found no reference in that report where it says that pensioners must be compensated by government. But that is not, I'm not saying that we should not dialogue over that, but I'm just saying that the question is premised on the understanding that the Justice Smith-led Commission of Inquiry recommended compensation of pensioners to be done by government. And I'm saying that this is not the case. So please note that the Commission of Inquiry did not just investigate private occupational pension funds, which are the funds, over which is a regulator, we have overview, but it also investigated NASA. And I think when we discuss this, we forget about NASA, but I think NASA is a very important player, I think, in this dialogue. It also investigated the government pension scheme, because in fact, some of the complaints that we're dealing with, some of the pensioners that we entertain in the commission are actually government pensioners. So my reading of the report in relation to the recommended compensation is as follows: that for private occupational pension funds in NASA, compensation should mainly be based on assets that survived hyperinflation, which I would want to refer to as asset redistribution rather than compensation. And I think let's understand this, because we then get distracted, in this discussion, because there's too much reference to compensation, and I do know we should talk about compensation, but the reference really was mainly around asset redistribution. The private sector in NASA had assets that could be equitably redistributed in the post-2009 period. Benefits were to be paid in US dollars since the inquiry was done when we were still in a multi-currency environment. I understand that the recommendation was made because at least 85% of the assets that were in the insurance and pension industry during the investigation period had been acquired prior to 2009. There was extensive review of the portfolio allocations of life insurance companies and pension funds. And since taking office as commissioner, I've also done this review. And I can assure you that 85% of the assets were in real assets. And when we talk about real assets, we are talking about properties. And we see a lot of properties in the Harare skyline. You go to Bulawayo, you go to Mutare, a lot of those properties are owned by pension funds in life insurance companies. There was a certain amount of money in monetary assets, and which, as we all know, yes, disappeared due to hyperinflation. So the issue here, or the issue should not have been about blame pointing. And I really welcome your remarks, Kenyas. And unfortunately, this is what happened. You know, there was a lot of blame counting, there was a lot of snake pointing, snake throwing, and so on. And I want to say that this is not about blame pointing. This discussion should be about ensuring that pensioners, that policyholders get what is due to them. This debate should be about making sure that the many pensioners get what is due to them. And I'm not talking about just active pensioners. I'm talking about all of us, because all of us, we've been working, we've been making contributions, you know, towards retirement. We want to make sure that we get what is due to us. What I often refer to is reasonable benefit expectations. Okay. It should be noted that the Commission of Inquiry's analysis of factors causing loss of value is contained in Chapter 5. And we must read Chapter 5 of the report attributed the loss of value to 3 categories of factors, namely macroeconomic factors. I think this was about 42%. We all know that government has a responsibility to create an enabling environment. Yes. There was also regulatory failure, which is, I think, 21%, and institutional factors at industry level. And some of these institutional factors included cannibalistic expenses. In fact, they are referred to as cannibalistic expenses. Poor governance, you know, in the pension funds, in the life insurance companies. However, according to the recommended framework, there is no compensation for value due to geopolitical factors. That is inflation, economic sanctions, and of course, opportunity cost of an economic recession, which adversely affected on the pension and policyholder values. In addition, the Commission of Inquiry report did not recommend compensation for regulatory failure. Therefore, compensation is based on assets that survived hyperinflation, as informed by the principles governing contracts for different insurance and pension contracts, you know, that were prevailing, and adjustments recommended by the Commission of Inquiry to take into consideration the impact of inflation and currency reforms. Therefore, my key takeaway, you know, from the recommended compensation framework is that it is pragmatic and premised on the understanding that policyholders and pension scheme members could not be fully insulated from the effects of an economy which was in recession. Insurers and pension funds were prudent in their investment strategies during the years of macroeconomic instability, to the extent that that's why we had the bulk of assets surviving hyperinflation. And as such, what is simply required, in my view, is to account to policyholders and pension scheme members on how the operating environment impacted on the assets that supported their liabilities. So I also thought, Mr. Moderator here, that I'll take this opportunity just to update members on the progress registered to date with respect to the issue of compensation by the private sector. So IPEC received the official mandate to implement post-inquiry reforms in September 2018. Recall, the Commission of Inquiry was released 2017 and IPEC received its official mandate in September 2018. This was a very broad mandate, very broad. To spearhead, simply said, IPEC should spearhead the implementation of the Commission of Inquiry recommendation, and some of which recommendations, of course, were beyond the scope of the Commission. So, according to the Commission of Inquiry report, IPEC was expected to require institutions to prepare, approve, and submit compensation schemes within a year of a date to be specified by IPEC. The compensation scheme should be comprised of the following reports and processes: to identify all potential claimants and communications with them, to calculate the quantum of loss in respect of each claimant based on standardized assumptions, methods, and models set by the regulator, to invite potential claimants or their representatives, complainants, pressure groups, media, and the public to comment on the compensation schemes and raise any questions which they may have, and to consider payment mechanisms and payment timetables, and to submit the compensation scheme consisting of the actuarial reports, audit reports, complaints, queries for consideration by the regulator before it approves the scheme. And several engagements were actually done, by the Insurance and Pensions Commission with the industry to unpack the findings of the Commission of Inquiry during the last months of 2018. And in addition, there were also engagements with government. And I want to advise members that even the engagements with governments are ongoing as we have this debate. The engagements were for clarity in terms of the scope of reforms to be implemented by the Commission. And the clarity received was that IPEC should champion private sector compensation, legal and regulatory reforms. And some of you may be aware, I think, of the strides that we've already taken, around this. You are all aware of the regulatory reforms. You are all aware that the Pensions and Provident Funds Bill is currently before Parliament. The IPEC bill is currently with the Cabinet Committee on Legislation. The Insurance Bill is also currently before the Cabinet Committee on Legislation. Some of the recommendations were around capacitation of the Commission, obviously, to avoid the regulatory failure that was experienced during the hyperinflation era. And I think my presence here is evidence of that capacitation. I'm sure you'll agree. There's been a lot of strides by government to make sure that the Commission is well capacitated to deal with the issues of regulatory failure. I also want to assure members that within the Commission itself, the Commission is not what it was before. We've made a lot of progress to capacitate. We now have, for the first time, we have a fully fledged actuarial department. We have lawyers, we have macroeconomists, we have accountants within the Commission, skills which were not there before. What ensued, though, with respect to engagements with the industry, was just blame shifting. Before we do this, we want government to do this. Before we do this, can you look into this? Without addressing the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry, which, like I said, the focus was on surviving assets. A compensation committee, though, this is now, we have now put in place a compensation committee comprising of IPEC and industry stakeholders, which we are hoping that the committee will facilitate discussions in relation to the 2009 compensation. Compensation by NASA. With your permission, Mr. Moderator, I do not want to dwell on this. I think we should have invited NASA to come and be part of this discourse so that they can speak for themselves what they are doing. And as you also know, We do not regulate NASA, so I do not want to go into a territory where perhaps maybe I might err. But an analysis of the Commission of Inquiry of conversion methods and processes in 2009 concluded that there was no equitable distribution of those assets between shareholders of life insurance offices, policy holders, and pension scheme members, as well as, I think, the different cohorts of pension contributors in the same pension scheme. Therefore, the Commission of Inquiry recommended ways in which benefits should be recalculated for each life insurance and pension product. The compensation of members of the civil service pension scheme was to be made by government. Since, as you all know, this was a fund, it was a pay-as-you-go with no surviving assets. And as such, compensation can only come directly from the Consolidated Revenue Fund. And our understanding is that government has already put in place measures to cushion the welfare of civil service pensioners by paying them US dollar benefits. And there was also, I think, reference to compensation of policyholders and pensioners of failed insurance companies. This was not explicitly stated in the report in the absence of policyholder protection funds. There is also a category of pension funds, mainly parastatal funds, which are in an unsound financial position due to pension contribution arrears, which are going back to the 2000s. I think a case in point, and these days I believe in naming and shaming. I know a lot of people do not like this, but I think this is a topic where we should all be comfortable in naming and shaming, because without naming and shaming, we will not be able to deal with this issue. I think a case in point is the Cold Storage Company Pension Fund, which last received contributions in 2001. Members of such funds would require government's intervention for the sponsoring employers to make good the arrears, or a direct injection, I think, from government, since the employers may not have the capacity to pay the contributions. So I think for us, one of the areas of focus has been asset separation and asset redistribution by private occupational pension scheme members and life offices. We think this is key, to any redistribution process. We feel asset separation is key. It's in the Act, it's mandatory, but we are aware that there was no asset separation. And IPEC is enforcing recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry with respect to asset separation and asset redistribution. So I'm always asking myself, if life offices and pension funds are paying well, and I think they are paying well, they are paying their workers well. For me, the big question is, why can't they pay policyholders? Why can't they pay policyholders? I'm aware that the Commission of Inquiry recommended that government should revisit the demonetization process done, which was from 15 June to 30 September 2015, as this was found to be prejudicial on account of the parallel exchange rate of, I think then $1 to 35 quadrillion, I think then, which was used, to convert long-term savings from the Zimbabwe dollar to the US dollar. The then prevailing official exchange rate was $1 to, I think, 140.7 billion or something, somewhere thereabouts. I think I'm happy Itai has joined the meeting, because I do know that he was part of that Commission of Inquiry, and he probably will be able to shed more light, I think, on this. So I think this would entail an outlay on the part of government, yes, to demonetize monetary balances in maybe perhaps not just the banking sector, but rather fixed income securities such as bonds and treasury bills. Allow me, Mr. Moderator, I think, to turn now to the second round of loss of value, because I think we are talking about pre-2009, but we are all aware that we've actually had a second round, of value because of the currency reforms. I think you are all aware another currency conversion took place in 2019, and while IPEC was still seized with the implementation modalities for compensation recommended by the Justice Smith inquiry, our focus was diverted to the provision of guidance. Recall, we were accused of regulatory failure, and we wanted to make sure that this time round, we are not accused of regulatory failure. So we were seized with the implementation modalities for compensation. And this time round, our focus has been on providing guidance to the industry on how to convert values from USD to Zimbabwe dollars in a way that doesn't prejudice policyholders and pensioners. And as you are aware, or as some of you might be aware, we issued a guidance paper, at the end of December 2019 to the industry, which we later on actually converted to a statutory instrument because we wanted to enforce compliance. And this guidance on currency reform was issued, and the Commission is currently enforcing guidelines. So I think in summary, for me, just to summarize, I think the heads of my argument here, the primary responsibility to compensate lies with the insurance companies and pension funds, as their relationship with the policyholder and pension scheme members is contractual. And however, the contracts between the parties were adversely affected by external factors beyond their control. We want to acknowledge that. Hence, the recommended use of surviving assets that supported liabilities to policyholders and pension scheme members as the most objective way of ensuring fairness amongst the parties. But however, having said that, I did say that we also are in dialogue with the government to the extent that, yes, they were also culpable, and to the extent that government has a responsibility to create an enabling environment. And government may consider bailing out the industry in the spirit of social protection. For me, I just want to add, Mr. Moderator, by saying that for me, it speaks to the restoration of confidence in the industry. If we do not address this issue, we are not going to restore confidence in the industry. And I'm record as I engage our regulated entities that we need to restore the principle of uberrime fides in the industry. That is utmost good faith. If we are to expect our children, our grandchildren to believe in insurance, if we are to expect our children and our grandchildren to believe in pensions, we need to address this issue. There is no one who is going to entrust their money with somebody who is not able to account for previous savings, and you continue. Short of madness, nobody is going to be able to do this. So this is why, for me, it is absolutely important that we restore confidence in the industry by addressing this very important issue of asset separation and asset redistribution of the surviving assets, those assets which survived hyperinflation. I just want to thank you once again for this opportunity to participate in this dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Grace. You didn't disappoint, as I expected. You were clinical in your approach. And I think with Itai having arrived, I'm going to propose that we actually invite Itai up to make his delivery, which is in essence a summation of the findings of the commission. If you could come up, we would appreciate, and join us up here. And then I'll give you the floor. And then those who are online, we are actually going to have 3 sessions And the quality of debate, the questions you're going to raise are going to be quite critical. Our platform is open. Please do get into our chat room and raise your questions. We will consider you as though you were here in terms of, dealing with your questions and comments. And I think the spirit that Grace has exhibited is one that is very vital, because if we maintain dialogue and cool heads, there is no problem that can withstand, the assault of common thinking, a desire to actually find solutions, and most importantly, a way forward so that we never find ourselves where we are. So Itai, over to you so that our viewers, our participants can get a concrete understanding of what the commission actually, investigated and found out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and good morning all participants in this debate. I'm going to provide an overview of the work that was carried out by the Commission of Inquiry into the conversion of insurance and pension values from Zim dollars to US dollars. But I must hasten to say, I will not belabor this, because listening to the Commissioner, Dr. Mradzikwa, I noticed that she has, touched on a lot of the issues that arose from our report. I'll just probably reinforce what has already been presented by the Commissioner and say the Commission was tasked with looking at a multiplicity of terms of reference. But I've noticed that whenever people make reference to the report of the Commission of Inquiry, it looks like compensation is the most contentious matter that arose. But if one looks at the terms of reference, there were, I think, about 14 terms which, enabled the Commission to investigate the assets and how they progressed over time. I think the inquiry ran for a period from about 1996 to 2015. That's 20 years. So we had the opportunity to get into the affairs of insurance companies and pension funds and look at the progression of assets, both in nominal terms and in real terms, so that we could really place our fingers on when the wheels actually got off the rails, right? So in doing that and looking at the various other aspects, the way that liabilities were also progressing alongside the assets, our administrators were conducting their affairs, the expenses associated with administering these schemes, etc. We then noticed that there were various causes to the loss of value or prejudice occasioned to insurance policy holders, as well as pension fund contributors and membership. And we categorized them into three categories, namely macroeconomic causes of value, and regulatory causes, as well as the micro or institutional causes of loss of value. So we recognize that loss of value was occasioned at those three levels. At the top level, governmental policy holder level, the regulatory level, as well as the institutional level. When you look at the macroeconomic causes of loss of value, we notice that inflation, currency debasing, and the exchange rate that was used during the demonetization of the Zim dollar to US dollar in 2015 were identified as major factors that indeed caused pensioners and policyholders prejudice. Inflation, on the one hand, resulted in the loss of benefit values through the erosion of fixed premiums and pension contributions that were not indexed to inflation, right? So if you consider a life policy where someone is being promised on subscription, let's say a sum assured of $100,000. I remember when I started working in early 2000, I was very excited when I subscribed to a life assurance policy, which actually promised me 150,000 Zim dollars in 20 years' time. And I thought, geez, I'm going to be one of the richest people in Zimbabwe. But in the next, I think, 5 or so years, I was earning much more than that, and I had stopped contributing towards that policy because it didn't make any sense. So what was actually happening is that those people who had subscribed to policies which had promised sum assured, by failing to index that promise to inflation and also indexing the premiums that are being paid in fulfillment of that policy, there was natural erosion on the whole concept. That was the number one, influence of inflation on premiums and contributions, as well as on benefits. In addition, inflation caused for certain assets that were being used to provide for the liabilities, like fixed income securities, negative real investment returns, right? Because the returns on fixed income securities could not keep pace with inflation. It actually meant that the assets that are committed to meeting future liabilities were lagging behind inflation. So there was erosion. In real terms, those were negative returns. So this affected bonds, treasury bills, money market instruments, which resulted in loss of value. Hence, what we noticed is the industry being alive to this. The asset managers who were managing the portfolios were actually shifting away from monetary assets or fixed income securities towards more hedging assets such as equities and real estate, right? Which is why there was actually a finding that, contrary to popular belief that the hyperinflationary era wiped away assets, this was actually not factual. We realized that at least 85% of assets had made it through the hyperinflationary era into the dollarization era. So it actually means that only 15% of assets, which we attribute to asset allocation that was in fixed income and monetary assets meant to cover current liabilities. So because people were seeing hyperinflation, they were making very rational decisions, and people actually hedged by moving or reallocating towards, assets that were more resilient to inflation, right? So I just thought that is an important point, so that when we talk about compensating using surviving assets, we are all cognizant that they are surviving assets. I think the issue that then arises is that because of inflation, the distribution of those assets is where the issue is, right? Just to give an example, during the period August 2006 to February 2009, the central bank removed 25 zeros, a total of 25 zeros from our currency, right? So what that did is, imagine someone like me who had been promised $150,000. By the time we had removed 6 zeros, I was done with, right? The other 19 zeros would also have wiped out a lot of the liabilities that were seated in the industry. However, by removing the zeros, you would notice that if you are running a balance sheet, both your assets and liabilities will be affected. So you've got assets which have been affected similarly like liabilities. But what happened in dollarization is that there was a revival of the asset values in US dollars, and everyone forgot about the liabilities, right? So assets, liabilities zeroized by removal of zeros. When you had your balance sheet in US dollars, you revalued your assets, and boom, you had a US dollar value for your assets, but liabilities were zero. And we all know from accounting that assets should equate to liabilities and equity. So when your liabilities are zeroized, it means there's actually a transfer of those assets to equity holders, especially for life assurance companies. So what we're saying is inflation caused a shift or a reallocation of these assets. But I wouldn't say it's inflation really, because when you are reviving assets, and you are not reviving liabilities, I don't think it's fair to blame inflation without blaming the institutions themselves who were responsible for a situation where all of a sudden there is a shift in favor of policy, I mean in favor of shareholders ahead of policyholders. But that is one of the things that inflation did. This also resulted in abnormally low Zim dollar benefit values, which upon conversion to US dollars, for some pensioners received as little as 5 US cents. You know, when we went around the country doing in the early stages of our inquiry, we were actually shocked to see people present to us checks that had been written out in full and final settlement, ranging from a few cents to a few US dollars. You know, after this is despite several years of contributing to these pension schemes. Like I said, assets that were supporting insurance and pension liabilities were transferred to shareholders of insurance companies or became surpluses in some defined contribution pension schemes, right? Furthermore, from a macro point of view, in addition to the debasing of currency as well as inflation, we also had the issue of the demonetization, which happened in 2015, despite dollarization having taken effect in 2009. And what we then noticed was, anyone who had an account, there was sort of a thumbs up approach to award $5 US per account holder. And if you had quite significant amounts in your account, there was a formula, but it didn't account for much. We noticed that the entire industry, the entire industry got about 135,000 US dollars from that demonetization process. So the question that one asks is, did insurance and pension funds in their totality hold assets just equivalent to 135,000 US dollars? That is, had they allocated just so little to support liability payments, on the money market? We thought that was the basis upon which, like the commissioner said, the commission recommended that government may need to reconsider the demonetization with a view to bringing justice rather than just convenient closure to the issue of demonetizing Zim dollars. Moving on to regulatory causes of loss of value. We noticed that government and the regulator for insurance and pensions had a role to play because of their failure during the hyperinflationary and debasing and conversion of insurance and pension values, that they failed to monitor that process, right? So when you talk of the regulatory level, we're really talking about the Reserve Bank and IPEC as it was then. I don't want to rub against the commissioner here. So I think fair to recognize that arising from our recommendations, a lot of capacity, the commission has done a lot to be capacitated to be able to play a more proactive role rather than leaving things happen right under their eyes without them doing anything about it. I'm glad the commissioner spoke about what they did in the second round of loss of values and providing guidance to the industry, and even transforming such guidance into legal instruments such as statutory instruments. I think that is commendable. But however, in 2008, 2009, this was not the case. Things just happened. Although there was a regulator, there was no guidance. One thing that was expected was, how does the industry now start converting, liabilities from Zim dollars into US dollars. We felt that the regulator needed to have played a very proactive role, but that was not the case. So IPEC at that time failed to conduct on-site supervision and investigate its licenses, which allowed for arbitrary insurance product terminations by insurance companies, poor investment management practices, poor record keeping, and failing to deal with predatory administration expenses, amongst other issues. Right. Talking about arbitrary insurance product terminations by insurance companies, what we realize is companies would just do what they felt was convenient for them, and there was no consequence from the regulator. By nature, these insurance policies are contractual in nature, and it is trite at law that where two parties have concluded a contract, the terms of that contract cannot be unilaterally altered by one of the parties without a consent from the other party. But this actually happened in the industry, and there was actually no consequence to that, despite even those that were affected complaining to the regulatory authorities at that time. Moving on to micro or institutional level, the causes of prejudice that are attributable to the institutions themselves. We noticed that a lot of factors happened at institutional levels, such as the failure to index contributions, premiums, and benefits to inflation, like I mentioned earlier on. There was also arbitrary and prejudicial conversion methods from Zim dollar to US dollar. So because there was no guidance, any institution just adopted a method that best suited them. And as you can imagine, if an institution is left to its own whims, it will act in a manner that preserves shareholder value, because these are institutions controlled by capitalists. So we saw a tendency to preserve capital by institutions ahead of the need to balance out such preservation of capital against cushioning liabilities, right? There was also the arbitrary termination of products and closures, pension contribution arrears. In most cases, we noticed, despite employees having paid or having had pensions deducted from their pay slips, there was no corresponding investment of those with the pension funds. So the sponsor financed their affairs using pension contributions to the detriment of pension fund members. And this was a huge issue. I think in 2015, around December 2015, we quantified cumulative contribution arrears to have been between 300 and 350 million US dollars. That's just the extent of prejudice occasioned to pension fund members by the institutions themselves. Failure to separate insurance, pension, and shareholder assets. So I think the Act requires that there be separation between shareholder affairs and policyholder affairs, but we realized that there was a lot of commingling between this. There wasn't much adherence or compliance with that. There was poor record keeping, as most institutions could not account for assets, investment returns, and individuals' contribution records. We were amazed to realize that just asking for information with 20 years of historical data was such a daunting task. Why we were amazed is that this is an industry which is underwriting liabilities which are long-term in nature. If you go and talk to a 23-year-old who has just graduated from university and you are promising them, a payout when they retire at 65, it actually means that you're expected for the next 42 years to maintain their records. But there was dismal failure just to account for information in the past 20 years. Various excuses were preferred, including that, technology had changed from floppy disks to flash drives, and therefore, there was failure to try and access information which was seated on floppies, but the long and the short is, for an industry which is underwriting long-term liabilities, the expectation at a minimum is that there must be systems in place to make sure that record keeping is up to scratch. Failing to account for 20 years of data when you are writing 40 years of promises, I think is just something that the regulator needs to do something about. Right. There was also poor corporate governance practices, unsustainable administration, and other expenses, which in some cases we realized that administration expenses in some cases accounted to 300% of pension contributions. So it actually meant that in some cases, all that has been contributed needs to be augmented by assets so that you meet the expenses for administering these schemes, right? So in light of that, our recommendations were centered around those findings. And because we realized that 85% of the assets had survived, and what the problem was really was the distribution or allocation of those assets. Our major, issue was that there ought to be, institutions need to revisit the way that they converted their liabilities in 2009, and do so in a manner that remedies the ills that we observed, that inflation should not cause for an allocation of assets from either from either the policyholder to the shareholder, or between and amongst policyholders and pension fund contributors themselves, because we actually noticed that there seemed to be a shift towards assets were allocated more to those that joined schemes during hyperinflation because of the higher weight that was given to the amounts that were contributing relative to those that had contributed during stability, right? So what it meant was the younger guys, creamed off what the older guys had actually worked for over the last 40 or so years. So all we said was, IPEC should superintend over a process where institutions come and they show the regulator how they converted. The regulator looks at how that should be sorted out and signs off a plan where there's actually a redistribution. In some cases, for insurance companies, some of them who are listed, I think shareholders have been paid and some dividends in the dollarization era, which could very well have been monies that are attributable to policyholders. I think that needs to be put right. There needs to be a clawback, by probably, floating rights issues, raising capital to pay back, these liabilities. So from a compensation perspective, I think those were some of the recommendations. We also recommended that government revisits the issue of the demonetization process that I said resulted in the entire industry just getting about 135,000 US dollars, and the other bone of contention, which we believe needs to be addressed by the regulator, is to come up with legislation that compels a company to actually make contributions to the pension fund when it has deducted funds from its contributing employees. Because what then happened in some cases, someone hits retirement age, they go to the pension fund because they know they've been contributing to the scheme, and then they are told, we were not receiving your contributions, therefore we are unable to pay you because we had no assets coming through from your contributions. Then the person would go back to the employer, and the employer tells them, your obligation for pension lies with the pension fund. So there was a lot of tossing, of contributors back and forth between employers and the pension schemes, which we thought was very immoral. And we believe that the pension contributor needs to come up with legislation or regulations that compel sponsors to actually honor their pension investments with the pension funds. There is a whole host of other recommendations, but I thought because compensation was the major issue we're talking about, I will not delve into those, but suffice to say, those that are interested, the report of the commission is a matter of public record. I think having been gazetted sometime in 2017. So I think it's something that is available even on the IPIC website, if I'm not mistaken. So I invite those that would like to learn more about the recommendations to read through from the report of the Commission of Inquiry. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Wow. Thanks, Itai. I think, any third party that wasn't Zimbabwean who would be listening to this, you would just say, what a scam, isn't it? And genuinely, I think there are issues. This is a major debate. This is the debate, in my humble opinion. There are various issues that have been raised. I'm glad now we are almost on time. We started 15 minutes late. And so I'm going to allow half an hour of deliberations on both presentations. And I'm going to ask our team that's monitoring our comments and questions to be on standby, to be able to read those out to us from where you are. And then I will also then address the members who are present here. And I wonder whether anyone is as excited as I am with comments or questions. And I can take maybe 3 at a time. I've written copious notes of issues that I would want addressed. But since I have the mic, I will allow you the common courtesy. Any comments from the floor? Yes, sir. If you could identify yourself, we've got a roving mic. Identify yourself by name, and then very briefly, you can make your intervention. Thank you, sir.
My name is Martin Tarusenga. I'm from the Zimbabwe Pensions and Insurance Rights Trust. My comments will be in 2 parts. First, I'm looking at the debate as advertised, the topics and the premises used. And next, I'll just comment briefly on what Madam Commissioner has presented to us and what Itai Chirume has also presented to us. Now, Mr. Chairman, there are several issues to note about the debate as advertised, not least the following. The debate topic itself and the underlying premise of the debate, the real contentious issue in pensions and insurance as sectors, as economic sectors. And finally, the note I would like to raise is persons arising from this debate. Now, to go straight into the debate topic itself and the underlying premise of the debate, the debate is that should government compensate pensioners in line with the Justice Smith report? Does life assurance pensions work in a hyperinflationary environment? And is medical cover working in Zimbabwe? And these topics, or should I say just one broad topic, is premised on a statement, and not my phraseology here. The value of pensions and medical insurance has been drastically eroded due to economic turbulence, currency reform, dollarization and de-dollarization, and some statutory instrument. Mr. Chairman, I want to stress that this is a statement. It's not grounded in fact. The premise, obviously, I would like to focus now on the premise, which is a statement, is obviously lacking for the following reasons. The first being that it does not state by how much the value of pensions and insurance was drastically eroded. Secondly, it is further not specific what this value of the many values that can be quoted in pensions and insurance exactly refers to. Note here that the term value in pensions and insurance has very specific categorical meanings. There would be, you could refer to asset value, you could refer to liability values embedded. There are many values that you could that could be quoted in pensions and insurance. And finally, the statement does not say the source of this bold claim of drastic erosion and how the finding was arrived at. Clearly, Mr. Chairman, the premise is ambiguous, I have to say, I'm afraid. And without clarity on the value referred to in the premise of the debate, Mr. Chairman, the debate is also ambiguous. And, you know, one could be excused to say it's a farce. I mean, I'm just homing in on how the debate, you know, was advertised. And, you know, to some people, it might not be the big debate as it was dubbed. Now, that takes me to the real contentious issues in the two sectors. The current topic of debate in pensions and insurance, Mr. Chairman, is the correctness or otherwise of benefits calculated by insurance companies and related service providers. That is the current topic. Talk to any pensioner, policy holder, and pension fund members. That is the topic of debate. One just has to bring the matter to a freely accessible public forum and listen for themselves what pensioners, policy holders, and pension fund members have to say. The current topic of debate is not, Mr. Chairman, and I emphasize, about whether government should compensate pensioners or about whether or not pensions or insurance work. Pensioners and insurance policy holders of all insurance forms have, in a clarion call, charged that benefits calculated by insurance companies and related service providers are wrong. This is why, in fact, the Justice Smith Commission of Inquiry was set up in 2015. And this commission recommended compensation. Because if it did not, then the commission didn't do its job, its mandate, according to the terms of reference then. Of course, Mr. Chairman, the government should compensate any pensioner or insurance policy holder. Of course, government should not compensate any pensioner or insurance policy holder unless it contracted with that government, as in the case of NASA and as in the case of the Public Service Pension Fund. Of course, pension and medical insurance is always and will always work, will always be relevant in Zimbabwe. Life assurance, medical insurance, and pensions work in all socio-economic environments. They are an intrinsic part of human life, serving to mitigate the adversities of life, such as death, ill health, old age, disasters upon people, disasters upon undertakings, among others. There's a long history of pensions and insurance in all societies as it evolves from the averseness of humans to life risks. Life insurance and pensions do not, I stress, Mr. Chairman, work if we have inept personnel. And I'm glad you have acknowledged that, you know, there were quite some ineptness in the pension insurance sectors. Now, to get back to the questions arising from the debate. So, in circumstances when the debate is founded on an ambiguous premise, and when the debate topics really poses trivial questions with ready, well-established, known answers, it has to be said that the motivation of the debate becomes curious. The debate becomes even more curious when it is observed that there is selective naming of hyperinflation economic turbulence, government as apparent causes of problems in the pension insurance sectors, and not the naming of the other direct players, such as insurance companies.
Saying, and what we can do is focus then on the issues that you have.
I've actually finished my first
No,
part of
unfortunately, from a time perspective, I've got to be fair. We've got half an hour, and
Okay.
I would like us to really focus.
I
Let
would
me
ju-
just bring it into context. The issues pertaining to the medical funds, for example, will come later.
Okay.
And right now we are focused on the report itself. And I accept and buy your logic in terms of, have we framed the question correctly? So let's debate the fact of benefit calculations, which was the real raison d'etre of the Commission of Inquiry itself. I think we've received incisive comments by the Commissioner of IPEC, and then also an executive summary. Do you have any specific issues pertaining to what they presented, so that we move out of the query around the phrasing of the debate itself? I concede on that point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I'll just
Very, very briefly, 2 minutes. Thank you.
I note Madam Commissioner talked about and then emphasized that the compensation is going to be based on redistribution of assets. That to me sounds contradictory. If there were cannibalistic expenses, and then we want to use a method of redistribution, what assets are you redistributing here? Because the assets themselves come from contributions. And if there was overcharging, that is not correct. And further to that, the commissioner admitted that by nature, these are contractual arrangements. And if they are contractual arrangements, we should be looking at the contract. What does it say? And calculating from that. So I think, I've had quite a bit of time. I would have wanted to comment a little more.
Okay.
But these are some of the key points that we.
All right. I think on the back of that, I also would want to ask and pose our presenters the question. I mean, reading and hearing you, were they not cases of good practice? Are they not insurance companies that are worthy of mention? I like that spirit. You use the Greek terminology, the utmost good faith. Were they not some companies that depicted that good and fair practice that we would expect? So I think we can park that. I'll take 2 more questions from the floor, and then I'm going to ask our team to also load up on what our online guests are saying. Any other 2 from the floor? If not, how are we faring, Wilson?
We have one comment from Alfred Pendeke, where I'll just read it through. It's a very brief. The government should allow the insurance and pension industry to transact some of its business in hard currency. This will be key in ameliorating the effects of 1, loss of value, 2, loss of policyholder confidence. Furthermore, this will provide impetus to the VFEX, as well as providing the much needed liquidity to fungible counters that were suspended from the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange by government.
I think a fair comment, and it's one that's worthy reflecting on, because in other countries, even where exchange controls exist, like South Africa, 10% of a portfolio can be, invested outside the borders. And I think this is something which, the public should be very much interested in pursuing. Let's start with you, Grace. Initial comments and responses.
Okay, thank you very much, Nigel. I think let me take the last comment on government allowing insurance companies to transact in hard currency. I think it's a fair comment. Perhaps let me moderate it a little bit and say, even as a policy holder myself, what you are looking for is not necessarily hard currency. You are looking for a stable currency. So if the Zimbabwe dollar were stable, I don't think the issue of hard currency would even be an issue. So the reason why I think there is that demand for hard currency policies is because of instability, which is coming, with our own local currency. As a government, I think any government would want to ensure that their own currency is stable. And I guess, I think this is what we are seeing, the attempts we are seeing by introduction of the Dutch auction currency system and so on, which has of course resulted in some level of stability, I think, on our currency. But having said that, Mr. Moderator, we've been listening to the industry. We've also been listening to policyholders, and I can assure you that we've allowed certain classes of business to be transacted in hard currency. I think that's a fact. It's already happening in the industry. Our only consideration is obviously source of funds. We do not want to encourage a situation whereby you go to the black market to buy currency to come and insure your vehicle. For those entities and for those policyholders who can prove that they've got free funds, they're exporters, they're generating foreign currency, there is indeed a room for them to insure their assets in foreign currency. And then I want to turn now to Mr. Tarusenga. We are very familiar with Mr. Tarusenga. He is representing very ably, I think, the wounded, I want to use wounded pensioners. We hear you. I want to acknowledge that you have acknowledged that government has got no responsibility to compensate. In fact, that's what I heard, from you. So we are in agreement. The Commission of Inquiry did not say government must compensate. There are contractual issues, and when I referred to asset redistribution, I'm mindful of the fact that, when you analyze the portfolio allocations, it is a fact that 85% of the assets survived hyperinflation. They were investments in real assets. They were investments in properties. And when I engage the industry, I'm on record, asking them, when you are sitting in this building, the building is surviving for whose benefit? The building is surviving. It is existing for the benefit of pension holders. The owners of those buildings are the pensioners, and they need to derive value. So I think we're in agreement, and that is the conversation that is actually taking place with the industry. And I know you are aware of that. I did point out that it's a conversation which is very much on our radar. We are passionate about it, and I do hope you can feel some of the passion, I think, just from this engagement. We are very passionate about it, and we will get to the bottom of it. We had to deal with the second loss of value, the currency changes that took place in 2019. And, I said in my presentation, I'm pleased to say that I think we had a better handle, of the industry, when we had the second round of currency changes, and we're able to guide the industry. And we are currently seized with making sure that the industry indeed, they play their part. They make sure that they do distribute, I think, some of the revaluation gains, that we experienced in 2019. I just want to emphasize, what Itai said, that I'm not an accountant myself, but I do understand, I think, some of the simple principles of accounting, that accounting is a double entry process. I think when you talk accountants all the time, it's a double entry. So I think the issue here is that as the assets were revaluing, we needed to see similar revaluation happening of the liabilities. Okay, I think it's simple. It's a very simple process. It's straightforward. It's something that we all understand and acknowledge. And we do understand and acknowledge that perhaps there was indeed need for some guidance, to ensure that this happens. And this is something that is underway. I hope that is helpful. If maybe it's an assurance, you do have a commission which is very much alive, I think, to the issues and to the work that needs to be done. But we must acknowledge that this is a very complex process. It's a major assignment that we need to undertake, and it requires the cooperation, I think, of all the stakeholders to make sure that we do this properly. Thank you.
Itai, are you going to take a stab at some of the of the questions?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would comment on Martin Tarusenga's concerns about how the debate is couched. I think you shouldn't worry, Martin, because if it's a wrong question to say should government compensate and it's open to debate, I'm sure it will be answered on the other side, which would address your issues. So I wouldn't lose sleep over the verbiology of the question of the debate. I think the fact that it is a debate would make sure that when someone debates on the other side, you will probably address your concerns. I think that's all. And maybe
I'm still looking for best practice, you know, from the industry, because I think in any bad situation, if we just look on the negatives and don't actually recognize those who performed relatively better, it's a mess. This is a national mess. I couldn't couch it any better than that or any fairer because it is a mess. But at the end of the day, in terms of practice, what we want is to set a standard that we can actually look to. Was there any evidence of that, Itai and Grace, or very little?
Okay, so we did realize that some insurance companies fared better than others, and some pension funds actually fared much better than their peers. But suffice to say that the approach was uniform, right? So it didn't quite help that much that when you have adopted the same practices in converting your Zim dollar liabilities to US, and you fail to address the issues that were flagged, the issues of indexation to inflation, the issues of making sure that there is fair distribution between policyholder and, I mean, because no one revived liabilities, for instance, means that everyone had the same problem. So even if you pay out a bit more, the underlying problem was still the same. So because of that, there is scope that you know, this thing just needs to be sorted out.
Yes, I want to agree. I think with that what we have noticed is that I think there were others who did better than others, but I think the overall there's still a lot of work to be done. I must also state that the industry relies on experts. You know, the industry relies on the same experts, the same actuaries. You know, we had the external auditors. You know, and so one would not really expect much difference because the industry generally relied, you know, on the same experts to provide guidance, you know, conversion methods, you know, and so on. I think that's why there's this pressure that let's make sure that I think the process is perhaps revisited and like I said, we make sure that pensioners get what is due to them. I also want to say in the guidance paper that we've issued, the one which is currently being implemented by the industry, Section 7 of that guidance paper specifically requires, you know, all insurance companies and pension funds to make sure that they've set aside funds to address the pre-2009 period. So, you know, it is our expectation that I think as they move to distribute the revaluation gains, you know, due to the currency reforms, they will have undertaken that process and set aside those funds so that we're able to go back and revisit that area. I'm also pleased to say that we now have a regulatory actuary. So we are also in a position to have a view, you know, over, you know, the submissions which the insurance companies and the pension funds are going to submit to the commission. So we'll have an opportunity to review those submissions and express our own views. Thank you.
Okay, I really feel strongly about this, and maybe you as the commission, as opposed to the commission of inquiry, will also speak and address the issues of moving from defined contributions to defined benefits. Because I mean, we joined, you know, in all good spirit for a defined benefit. And then midway, it was convenient, technically, they then moved to DC schemes. And I think there is an issue there as well in terms of the injustice of those conversions. So, are they penalties, likely to go forward? And then perhaps as a third question, when do we draw a line? Because pensioners are suffering as we go, as we live. Pensioners have died. Insurance beneficiaries have died. Their children wallow in abject poverty, unable to be fed, to go to school. Is there, 2017, it goes public. We're in 2020 after another bout of hyperinflation. When, Commissioner, do we actually draw the date? Because, as you said, there've been responses, and gauging by the responses, it's capitalistic in nature by those, because they are beneficiaries. They are likely to have a very peculiar view on these matters. But surely what we should be aiming for is to actually draw a line and say that Justice Commission, that Justice Smith, is it, report must now be actually implemented by those, not government, but those insurance companies and pension funds. And then, of course, government itself must answer to its own pensioners who have been denied access to their pension.
Okay, thank you very much. I think very quickly, let me comment first on the transition from defined benefit to defined contribution schemes. This was not a compulsory exercise. I think with hindsight, it was a fad. It happened, at a time, and we were all employers, we were capitalists, and our consideration then was the unfunded liabilities, funding pension funds and sitting, on a liability that perhaps you could not quite get a handle on. Right now, I would say about close to 90% of the pension funds in this country are now defined contribution funds. But like I said, this was not compulsory. It was a voluntary transition. There were consultations, I think, between employers and pension fund members. Perhaps we didn't quite know what we were doing. We didn't know the implications, I think, of making that transition from a defined benefit to a defined contribution scheme. So I think the short answer to your question, Nigel, is that, again, this is a matter which is between employees and employers, to dialogue. There is always room to transition back to a defined benefit scheme, but obviously it's a very costly transition, given what has already happened and so on. But for us as a regulator, I think this is something that we do leave, to the pension fund members and their employers. Our focus right now has been to ensure that we have board of trustees who know what they are doing. I know Itai even referred to the issue of pension contribution arrears. We want a situation whereby a board of trustees should be able to sue an employer for contribution arrears. And this cannot happen when you have board of trustees who are conflicted. This cannot happen when you've got board of trustees who do not know what they are doing. So I think our focus has been to really make sure that now that the bulk of the pension funds are defined contribution schemes, it's important that we have board of trustees, who take their fiduciary responsibilities seriously. They know how to invest pension fund members' funds. They know the importance of controlling their costs, the governance issues, all the issues that we've been talking about. So I think that is our focus at the moment. And then I want to move to your question about the timelines. All I can say, Nigel, is that I think this is it's a critical issue. It's an important issue. It's an issue which we would like to attend to as soon as possible. Unfortunately, I cannot give you timelines, but I think for pensioners in this room, you will have noticed that certainly this year, if your pension was not reviewed, please see me. If your pension was not reviewed, please see me. I'm aware that we have seen pension benefits being reviewed. I think the highest that we've approved has been about 500%. And we are currently actually insisting on monthly reviews. That's what we are now calling for, monthly reviews of pension benefits. You know, that's just a demonstration, I think, of the fact that we do realize that there's time value of money, and that if there's going to be any re-indexing of pension benefits, it needs to be done now rather than later. So thank you very much.
Okay, just finally, I can't resist this one. I mean, you, by your own admission, poor record keeping is dismal. I mean, to quote Itai, surely that warrants and merits a penalty. You cannot tell me that an insurance company or a pension business has no records for the flimsy reasons given, you know, of having operated under a floppy disk. We know the underlying story behind that has got to be some fraudulent activity, surely. I mean, how in the world can we ever justify and allow people to walk away scot-free after people's hard-earned pension contributions have been made over decades? Now, surely, you know, I would want to see some consequence to that sort of thing. Am I being too assertive?
Not at all, Nigel. This is a real area of concern, you know, for us. Yes, we are writing long-term business, and you start work in employment at 18 years old, you retire at 65. You expect your pension fund or your insurer to maintain records, you know, and certainly that has not been the case. What we've done is the commission, I think also arising from these findings and observations, is that we have carried out an inspection of all the systems that are the pension funds and insurance companies are using. And we are insisting on robust systems. We are insisting on robust systems, you know, which are able to cater for the data requirements, you know, of our industry. The findings, I think, of that inspection were shared with the industry, and we've been engaging. We've been engaging pension funds. We've been insisting that they have got robust ICT systems. And in fact, with COVID-19 as well, it has made us even more vigilant and alert, I think, to the need for us to have robust systems. We've been interrogating and asking them to report to us on their business continuity plans, their onboarding systems, claims, settlement systems, you know, and so on. So indeed, I want to agree that there is no excuse for that. We are an industry, we are especially the long term, and we indeed need to have robust systems that I think speak to the demands of our business. There is no excuse for that.
Okay, thank you. Wilson, can we just have our online questions and comments, and then we will break for tea after the panelists have actually responded to them. Thank you.
Sorry for that. I'll have one from Oswell Bina and Lucky Saburi. I'll start with Lucky Sabao, sorry. Neighboring countries allow pension funds to invest offshore. Why not here? That's Lucky Sabao. Then Oswell Bina, the reputation of the industry is now tainted. Whilst insurance is meant to mitigate risk, the industry itself is now a risk. The business, is now the industry itself. Industry is exploiting its customers, both individual and corporates. And individual and corporates' experiences of loss of value continue to ameliorate against the potential of their investments.
Okay, thank you. So I think how do we restore confidence? Because, I mean, talk of infrastructure, we are all aware, nations are built at the core from pension and insurance savings. And so that I kind of feel explains our fraying of the infrastructure that we have. It explains the lack of scaffolding in town, in terms of, no construction is taking place, no long-term permanent investment is taking place or has taken place in Zimbabwe, perhaps over the last 20 years. How do we restore confidence? Madam Commissioner.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start with the quick one. Can we allow pension funds to invest offshore? I think the quick answer to that is that the new pensions and provident fund bill, I think, is going to allow for that, a certain level, of offshore investments. But having said that, I also want us to, just a word of caution. It seems people think that offshore investments are always the safer investment. It is not the case. We are aware of both individuals, corporates who have lost a lot of money offshore. There are lots of pyramid schemes. There are bank failures, even in those offshore markets, which we are all aware of. So, I think it's just a word of caution, but we are hoping that I think fund managers will still be cautious, and they will do their necessary due diligence, as they invest a certain portion, I think, of those funds offshore. And then I think to the question that you raised, Mr. Moderator, how do we restore confidence in the industry? Yes, indeed, our industry is strategic. In terms of savings mobilization, it's a very critical industry. I think when you also look at the value of assets under management running into multi-billion dollars, it's by far one of the largest industries. And therefore, I think we need to be serious about this industry. We need to make sure that the industry continues to play its strategic role in savings mobilization. And that cannot happen if we do not restore confidence to the industry. We need to get back to a point where, we are buying pensions, we are buying life insurance products. We see the value of actually taking up insurance. And we can only do that, I think, if we pay attention, to product designs. We must come up with products that speak, to the demands, of our customers. Every business, in fact, is doing that. And as an insurance industry, we should also be doing the same. And for me, like I said, addressing these compensation issues, we will also go a long way. We'll go a long way towards restoring confidence. We need to be able to own up on our obligations, as an industry. And unless we are able to do that, yes, this whole issue will remain an elephant in the room. I so submit. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Itai, you are an analyst and fund manager of fame. What is your take on this? I mean, Oswald makes the point. He says the industry itself is now a risk. A pretty cheeky comment, but pertinent when you consider, people's agony.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I think in light of what has happened, what doesn't help is we had a very, the experience of 2008, 2009 was sad. And what doesn't help is while the commission was still wrapping up its report, we had another round of losses unfolding. We've had 2 rounds of losses. Those that worked pre-2008 and lost everything and got into 2009 and started rebuilding their assets in US dollars. Sometime in 2019, thanks to SI 33 of 2019 and SI 142 of the same year, they again were back to square one. I think when such things happen, it's not surprising that the industry loses confidence in the sector, and it's good that we know why there's been loss of value. A problem well defined is half solved. So I think restoration of confidence has to do with placing remedies to the issues that caused the loss of value. I think something has to be done about 2008, 2009, and 2019. short of which we could very well be sitting on a dying industry, which is unfortunate because, like you rightfully said, Mr. Moderator, a lot of economic activity should actually be bankrolled by savings from the pension and insurance space.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our first session.
You're listening to Heart and Soul Radio Station.